Please hold on to your questions since we will have a Q&A sessions on both presentations after the second one is over. For the next presentation, we will have Mr. Ray Cunningham. He has a BA in East Asian Politics and MA in Human Rights, both from University of Utah. But more importantly, I think, he is a documentary photographer of normal life in different countries, and his pictures have been used in magazines, books, and newspapers all over the world. So I look forward to get a glimpse of what a normal life in North Korea looks like from his point of view. So please welcome Mr. Cunningham.
I'm first going to talk a little bit about tourism. People have some funny ideas about North Korean tourism, and I just wanted to present a little bit about what is tourism, how it's developed. Tourism in the DPRK is most often described as dark tourism to a morally reprehensible regime, and it's really reserved for the crazy traveler. And some scholars have written about this. John Connell, University of Sydney, has described North Korean tourism as theater tourism. Some of the tour operators have taken issue with this. He states all tourism in North Korea constitutes theater. You will see elements of that as I go along, but the idea that it is theater is linked to the idea of mass games, parades, demonstrations, monuments, and museums. But I think this is diversified over time, and we'll talk about that, as tourism has grown from just a few locations to take tourists in, and for those who want to say they've been there. I'm trying to give you an idea that it has changed over time. Some go to North Korea to see a Stalinist state, and maybe a theme park, or merely to travel back in time. Chinese tourists that I encounter in the DPRK will say, well, I'm traveling here to see what my country was like 50 years ago. It's not quite that way, but that's one of the attractions of tourism. I want to differentiate between tourism and journalists. I go in as a tourist for a very specific reason, and that is we are free to see places that journalists are not. Tourism in the North is not really a parallel activity to journalism. The North sees these two things as very distinct, restricting journalists and professional photographers. What happens when you apply for a visa? You have to state that you are not a journalist or a professional photographer. The tour companies are screening for people, and those are taken through a different agency. So there is a specific group that goes in for tourism, and that's what I prefer to do. All tourists go through the Korean International Travel Company of the DPRK, and this is the company that assigns guides, and really the outside agencies that you contract with are all running through KITC. These are the larger tour agencies that take groups in. These travel agencies take groups from generally 6 to 20 people on tours to various sites. Many of the tours are around holidays. They can go to certain places, but most people adhere to one kind of itinerary. Many of the tourists that I've talked to, I've always asked them, well, why would you ever come here? And they would say things like, well, this is my 190th country, and I just want to say that I've been there. So that's about 1/3. Another third are people who are academically interested in the DPRK, and they want to figure out a little more about it. Then there's a group of really hardcore people who go again and again and again. And that's the group that I'm in. We tend to go in and want to see new places. We want to cover the geography of the country and go to interesting factories, schools. I've been invited to teach English in the classroom, lots of different activities, so it does vary. The guides assigned, usually there is at least one member of the Korean Workers' Party. American groups that go are often assigned higher level party members, and it's quite interesting because what they do is ask us our opinions. They want to know, well, how can we have better relations with the United States? It's very interesting how all this works. Also, there is deference for Korean Americans. The guides will tend to treat Korean Americans much different, and that is, they give them deference. They can tend to do no wrong. In other words, they don't want me photographing this, but they can take all the photographs they want. So you do see this kind of interesting dynamic that goes on. Most of the Koreans in this picture are the guides that work for KITC. The 3 or 4 guides are generally assigned to a group, and that's typical. The guides have various interpretation of the rules. So you can have a really good guide who says, well, I don't care what you take pictures of, you can take pictures of anything. Or you can have someone that says, take no pictures unless you ask me first. There is a difference, and that's one of the reasons I go again and again. But now I know all the guides, so you just know what to expect. Americans initially were treated as different back in 2008, 2009. They were taken in separate groups, and we were treated as diplomats. It was very interesting. And again, high party members were assigned to us. I went in with one group, and they took us, they said, well, you can take all the photos you want. They took us to sites that tourists had never seen. They were really trying to see what we thought of things. So we were a survey group, the 6 of us. One of the things that happens is over time, the tour guides will then go down to 2 guides as the other guides go away, and they begin to trust you. And they say, well, this is a trustworthy group. We don't have to worry about them. And so you do build trust over time, something that I think is really important. The typical tourist itinerary is to stay at the Yanggakdo Hotel. We call this affectionately Alcatraz Island because it's on the island in the Taedong River and you can't leave. It's a nice place to view the city from, but you can't see much at all. Typical itineraries will go to the mass games, the mass gymnastic performance. They'll go to the Children's Palace, they'll go to the Victoria's Fatherland Liberation War Museum, the DMZ, Mount Myohang, where a Buddhist monastery is, and you'll go for a picnic and amusement park. In other words, you don't see very much at all. This is a typical 5-day itinerary. This is what 90% of the tourists will tend to do. But it doesn't really show you the country other than these specific places. The evolution of tourism up to 2009, Americans were separated, as I mentioned. Tours were limited Monday through Friday. I had a theory about that there were things going on the weekends they probably didn't want us to see. But in 2010, these restrictions were lifted. We could then go on the weekends and see the voluntary labor brigades out working in the parks and in the countryside. This actually changed the dynamics of tourism somewhat. They began to expand where you could go. More locations were added. I was in the first tour group to go to Hamhung, Hungnam, Chongjin, and to really see. And it was really interesting because the buses had trouble getting to the locations, but it was really rewarding as the people really had not seen tourists. We were treated extremely well by the local populace. It was very, very interesting to see how these new places were pioneered. By 2010, the restrictions on lengths of time were really lifted. Photo restrictions eased. You could photograph anything in Pyongyang you wanted. Now before, you really couldn't. And many of our photographs would be erased because we were taking pictures of inappropriate buildings. In 2013, travel to the Northeast was opened up, and that really changed things. We were going to many rural communities. I want to emphasize, though, that things don't quite go well on tours. The bus breaks down, you get there early, you get there late, and you see many things. And you see different things that, well, they prefer you not to see. Bus broke down in front of a village. We went into the village, had a wonderful time. That was not part of the itinerary. The guides get very nervous about things like that. In 2017, Americans were prohibited from traveling by the Trump administration. Tourism in the DPRK dropped 30 to 50%. It really hurt the tour agencies. One of the things they did was reach out to Central Asia, try to have more tours to make up for the revenue. This has been a real problem with many of those agencies. Now, one of the things that we say is that 3 M's are prohibited. Taking pictures of the military, interacting with the military. Markets were really forbidden to take pictures of, and misery. The problem is that they can't hide it, that it is there. And so you can take pictures of it, they just discourage it. Again, by day 4, they don't seem to care. I'm going to talk a bit about my impressions. This is Korea. And so many people make a misunderstanding about Korean history, culture, the relations with China, their historical experiences, and that's where the mistakes go. People fly in from New York, see the country, and then leave and have a distinct impression that is one born of the Cold War. And I want to really emphasize that it's not that two-dimensional society. That once you are there long enough, you begin to figure out that it's a society that is rather complex and it's rooted in its history. Indeed, tourists see things that they will generally really rather misinterpret. And that's one of the things why there's this great disconnect between our society and theirs. These are photos of a revolutionary opera in Hamhung Grand Opera House. We were the first group to come in. Groups subsequently haven't been taken there. We don't know exactly why, but this was really a fascinating experience. Tourists will indeed see red flags, propaganda, collective farms, and regimentation. This has less to do with the politics than of an isolated Korean culture with a nation-state formed in 1948 after occupation and with great Soviet influence and later Chinese influence. One must distinguish between that which is cultural and that which is political. And I think that's where we tend to get a little bit of a problem, because this was far easier in my travels in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. But in Korea, the culture is one of the primary drivers of most of what you see. Many of the manifestations of the state are borrowed from Imperial Japan, the USSR, the Chinese Revolution, and Korean dynastic history. And so you have to understand all of these before any of this makes sense. We tend to see the DPRK in the context of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union. It's a Cold War remnant. And I just don't think that that's really very useful. The majority of people today live in the ruins of a state inherited from Kim Il-sung. And it's a facade of what it once was in the 70s when there was relative prosperity. One of the things I really like to do is watch Korean movies. I love North Korean movies. They're really great to watch because you get a glimpse into the society as it was in the 70s, as it has become. They're really sentimental. They're you know, everyone cries at the end. They're really great movies, but they do give you a glimpse of what the society is like. Remember, this is a developing country, poor infrastructure, and a lack of electricity, petrol, and essential goods. While the showplace in Pyongyang is one of that is developing right now, really the rural areas are lagging behind. And that's evident from much of my travels. There isn't really a lot of development. Finally, development is coming to some of the larger cities, but much of the rural areas are not developed at all. Regimentation. This is what we think about when we think about the North. And that's the way they want to portray. That is one of the things that tourists generally see. We see people practicing, we see lots of different kinds of things. We enjoy lots of lectures on the American imperialist aggressors. Those are just things that are commonplace. But there's something else to really think about here. Behind the veneer of the society is a very human society. And that is, if you arrive early or late to something, these are the mass games young people who hold up the cards. They're beating each other over the head with them. It may be regimented, but it isn't that regimented. Teenagers act like teenagers. And so it is quite a human place when you get to know what's underneath. The propaganda state. The other piece of this that we see is this great propaganda state. The level of propaganda is unlike anything that I've experienced in the Soviet Union. China 35 years ago, when I used to travel there, or today by comparison. Cuba, Romania, there's nothing really like it. And while many of the styles of socialist realist art and regime agitation and propaganda are borrowed, it's still agitation and propaganda are most everywhere. Books, music, painting, the television is expressly for the purpose of spreading the ideas of the regime. It is really totally devoted to upholding the state. While some traditional arts have been preserved in the art studios, really most of the effort goes into this. You see them in the farms, the factories, the mountains, the roadsides. Really, this is one of the interesting aspects of the state and culture. Every time I come to one of the roadside murals, they also tell stories, by the way. I love to photograph them. And at every cooperative farm, they're building more of these monuments. So propaganda is total. You see it most everywhere. Now this is interesting because in the elementary and primary schools, you will see these indoctrination rooms. For many years they wouldn't show them to us. One day I was in an elementary school, primary school, and I said, I'd like to see the Kim Il-sung room. Oh sure, I'll take you right to it. This is the Kim Jong-il room, and this is where young people are indoctrinated and told stories about the state. Propaganda is everywhere. And to the subtle eye that you might not know what you're seeing. These flower murals are the Kim Jong-il and Kim Il-sung flowers. You'll see these, again, monuments to the leadership, but the average person would not understand what that is. And in most every balcony that you see, you will see flowers named after the great leader and the dear leader. It's just an idea of that total state, again. So what do tourists really see and how do they interpret what they see? It's really important. Stage photos. This idea of the theater state, are there stage photos? Oh yes, there are stage photos. And lots of them. This nice nurse posed for me in the Pyongyang maternity ward. There are posed photos, and that's what the mass games are really about, is, well, let's get the photographers there, we'll show the strength of the regime of the state. And so that's what they are for. However, there are photos that are not staged. And our bus broke down in front of women that were doing their laundry in a stream. And the guides, of course, were horrified that they were taking pictures of such activities. This is another unstaged photo. What this is a photo of the swallows. These are the young people who are cast out of their homes and live on the streets in many of the major cities. If you get up early enough in the morning, you can see them. These photos are strictly forbidden. But these realities do exist there. And you occasionally encounter these young people, but the guides don't want us to have anything to do with anything like that. Sometimes the guides lose control and circumstances overtake us. No, we're not supposed to take pictures of the military, but when the military comes to you and wants to have a photo taken with you, well, there's not much they can do. People-to-people contacts are occurring more regularly because, and I'll talk about the change in regimes and how this happened. People come up to you. That was not true in the early years at all. People shied away from you. But what is in fact happening is a new attitude. They want to talk with you. They want to come up and chat. This happened in 2008. My wife was up at the Grand Monument, and suddenly all these children, all these middle school children started gathering to see the foreigners. This photo is used in tourist brochures now for choreo tours because things like this did not happen back in 2008. And it's interesting how more people you're having more people-to-people contact today. In my estimation, the real North Korea, if you want to really see a measure of what's going on, is to go to rural North Korea. And it's not so much going to the beaches of Songdo-won or going to the ski resort or going any place like that. What I really think is I want to go out in the countryside. I want to go to the agricultural mining areas. The majority of my time has been spent there. And really, my first visit, I didn't get to see very much, but I really wanted to see the rural areas. And that, to me, is the most fascinating thing, particularly during harvest. Agriculture is considered a strategic asset and is militarized. Fields are guarded. Large meat production is in the hands of the local militia. We visited a meat plant where pigs were being raised. It was out in the middle of the countryside, guarded by the local militia. It was quite interesting because it was obvious the pigs hadn't been domestic. They were imported from Denmark. But in the fall, as they're drying the corn by hand, as they're harvesting it by hand, you can actually see what is going on. You can actually go out and help them too. Again, fields are guarded, it's a strategic asset, but it's a very interesting thing to watch. And again, harvests are not mechanized. None of this is mechanized, it's done by hand. In a few of the cooperative farms, some rice farming is mechanized, but again, what you generally see is this. And I really I enjoy photographing it. People, again, are very friendly, very forthcoming, and want to talk all the time. Generally in the homes, the local corn that's grown in the homes is dried on the roof. The pumpkins grow on the roof as well. It's quite interesting to see. Change has come. When you go out in the countryside, this is what you begin to notice. We began to notice changes. In 2008, the markets were tightly controlled by the state. There was some tolerance of external market selling that you could see. Having been involved with a lot of black market deals in Eastern Europe, you could tell when there was a middle-aged woman sitting on a box in the middle of the intersection or something, what was going on. However, by 2010, as Kim Jong-il, the regime allowed limited sales, you began to see changes. And this was hard to ignore by the guides. The guides did not like us taking pictures of anti-socialist activity. However, it just began to grow. By 2010, you began to see them cluster. And you see women, middle-aged women, this is who's driving this free market. The same people who were working in the state markets, women over the age of 40, were then now taking to the streets to sell quite openly. What is interesting is, now that we can walk up to any of them, when you walk up to them, they will give you change in Chinese renminbi, Korean won, US dollars, some even have euros, and one I encountered had Japanese yen. Chinese clothing is another thing that is sold openly. I was walking down the street in town and a man drops a bag in front of a group of middle school girls, opens it up, and he's got lots of clothes. Now the interesting thing is, the girls had money too to buy. We were always under the impression that there was a money shortage, but that really is not true. We do see free flow of goods. It's quite interesting. Again, you'll see free market sellers, they cluster. Now, another thing that has changed is that what you're seeing is food products that are prepared at home and brought out. Initially, it was fruit that was really unprocessed foods. Later, you began to see processed foods that were being sold by the market sellers. This is in the town of Haeju in the south, toward the South Korean border. This is quite interesting. And then we were allowed to go up and start buying all we want. It's another thing that is beginning to happen is that the free market is changing. This is the Kwanbak department store. Kwanbak department store was opened to everyone. And we got to go in and use Korean won, and we would go shopping. And it was interesting to see what was in there. And it was a measure of change. And it was really fascinating to see people coming in and purchasing items. No, you're not allowed to take pictures of the department store, but I did. I want to talk about a final impression of Korea. The transition between the regimes of Kim Jong-il to Kim Jong-un was really a gradual introduction via the media. We'd stay up late at night and watch as Kim Jong-un would be riding his white horse. And we would see him and his father visiting factories. It was a gradual, we would look for his name anywhere or his picture. And so gradually you began to see his introduction. It was my first visit after his death that I really began to see change. Koreans no longer shied away. Their sudden friendliness gave us experienced travelers pause because we didn't know what to make of it. This wasn't in Pyongyang, this was way out in the, it was in Horyong, it was way out in the coal fields, and it was really kind of interesting. But it continued. In Chongjin, we were herded through an indoctrination center about the regime. And they were beaming with pride. When you talk to people in the old days about Kim Jong-il, he wasn't that popular. You could tell by the phrases that they used things like, well, we only had one great leader in this country. Okay. So they were uncertain. My friends would say, I just don't know what the future is. I'm worried. The minute Kim Jong-un comes, you see the one thing that you never saw, and that is optimism. And that was really something that we began to see by most everyone. The pride on the part of the guides was really noticeable, and the mood was different. I've been through countless cynical lectures about Kim Jong-il. This was different. And so optimism, not just in some of these towns, but in everywhere. Pride in the schools, in the nuclear program, pride in the missile program. You began to see more of this. This is in a primary school. I spoke with a lot of in-country specialists, and they said that they too noticed the optimism. And by the way, this is the soda aisle in the Kwong Bok department store. And actually, it was interesting to watch shoppers there. Rather than buying necessities, they were all going to the junk food aisles and buying up things there. It was quite interesting to see. North Korea moved from a state of uncertainty to a perception that the economy and life was going to get better. And that is the difference that I've seen over time. Quite an interesting contrast between the two regimes. Just a few references, if you want. My photo book at the bottom was published in Leiden, and that is available. So thank you, and I guess we'll take questions.
Thank you, Mr. Cunningham, for another wonderful stories with pictures. So I will open it up to the audience. Yes?
So you mentioned how sometimes the bus would break down and you would just be talking to like villagers and stuff. When you would be having conversations with them, did it seem like they were aware of the situation that they were in? Like, are they aware of the differences between like what they're missing compared to like our society, or is that kind of just like hidden well enough?
Let me put it another way. I had a conversation with a woman, and she told me something. She said, I want to live in a place where my ancestors were here. I want to be buried up on that hill. This is my home. We fought for this land. I want to be in a nation where I am free to be Korean. And I think that we have a false perception of that everyone wants consumer goods or things, and I'm not really sure that quite applies in this case. Some people have said, I'd love to go to Paris. I'd love to, I'd love to go shopping and have some different clothes. But I've never gotten that impression. I've never heard anyone say, I want to leave here, or they're quite proud to be Korean and living there. They have some understanding of the outside. I'm not saying that. But no, I don't know. Have you ever encountered anything like that from your students?
I guess you're absolutely right that almost all North Koreans would have great national pride. So, but the students and staff members, or even local residents that I spoke to, they are aware that they are seriously behind in terms of economic development. There was no question about it. They knew it. And even one of the guides, what we call minors, he even said that he's happy with everything that he's given, except economy. He actually told me that. So, are they aware that they are actually behind? Yes, they